the idea of regenerative agriculture has really caught on, not only in the first world but also in the third world. So that it's a growing wave, and I actually see regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture as on an upward trend worldwide, hectares. And your conventional industrial model is actually on a downward trend worldwide. So, if you look at the trend, now's the time to get on the boat, if you will, otherwise it's going to leave without you.
The Biological Farming Roundtable podcast helps farmers explore innovative, low-input, regenerative and profitable farming systems. The Biological Farming Roundtable is sponsored by Nutrisoil, an award-winning biological liquid fertiliser made from a big worm farm. Nutrisoil's purpose is to empower farmers to produce life-enriching food. My name is Nicola Maddock. I work at Nutrisoil. I envisage a future where farmers are rewarded for producing nutrient-rich foods and consumers have this easily available to them. Today's podcast is co-hosted with Agroecologist David Hardwick at the first ever Cane Regenerative Farming Forum held in Ingham, Queensland. It was a brilliant event full of energy, support and innovative think sessions on how cane farmers can further improve their soil health. A key presenter and leader at the event was Simon Mattsson, who operates a 190 hectare property at Marion, 30 kilometres west of Mackay, producing sugarcane, soybeans and chickpeas in rotation in a controlled traffic farming system. Simon is a Nuffield scholar and a passionate soil health advocator who believes the biggest difference between the really resilient, successful farmers and the rest is their ability to take advantage of nature's free resources: sunlight, rainfall, carbon and nitrogen. This is our after-dinner conversation with Simon Mattsson. Today we are at the first ever Regenerative Cane Farming Forum. It's been held in Ingham on the 18th and 19th of March, and we have met some fantastic regenerative cane farmers. I'm here with David Hardwick, Agroecologist David Hardwick, who is on our recent podcast, and he's helping me co-host to meet some of these regenerative cane farmers, find out what it is that they're doing. But let's start with what is, happening in the regen cane farming space. So what's the difference between a conventional cane farm and a regen cane farm, David?
Yeah, well, g'day, Nicola. Yeah, I think, the guys that are regenerative, I guess, or whatever they call themselves, they're trying new things. They're trying to improve soil health. They're trying to bring diversity back into their farming systems, and they're trying to lower the inputs that they're using. Obviously, they've got a big neighbour next to them, the barrier reef, and they're really mindful of that. But they're trying to change and get a more ecological, regenerative approach to their farming system. So we've been lucky enough to meet a few of them up here in the forum. Yeah, it's been pretty inspiring. And we've got one of them here with us today, and that's Simon Mattsson. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here.
Yeah.
Always happy to chat soil health.
So, Simon, where did you start your journey into soil health? Like, when did it start for you?
For me, I guess it started right back in the yield decline joint venture, which was a big undertaking by the sugar industry. It started back in the 90s and concluded in 2006. Three major things came out of that, and that was that by adopting their suite of best management practices, we were supposed to get increase in organic carbon over time. Now, I adopted wholeheartedly, before it had even finished, I'd already adopted legume cover cropping as standard practice on my fallow. Controlled traffic farming, at that point in time, I still didn't have, in 2006, I still didn't have GPS guidance, but I certainly was trying to do that the best way I could at that point in time, and reduce tillage. So all of those things I'd adopted, and then by 2010, I guess I hadn't achieved much. I was certainly not seeing any rise in organic carbons.
So that was the big, well, not promise, but that was the big expectation that came out of that research. And obviously, sugarcane's a pretty intense farming system. I know it's a perennial grass, and once it's in the ground, you've got a 5 or 6 year sort of cycle with it. But it's still pretty hard on soil and hard on paddocks with the heavy machinery and the input use. So obviously, those expectations weren't met.
No, the recommendations just didn't go far enough, and I was searching for the reason why. And realistically, I guess I'd come to the conclusion by 2014 that the main thing that was missing was biological function. And as it turned out, in late 2013, I was awarded a Nuffield scholarship to study biological function. And yeah, that sent me around the world, looking for answers as to how I could address it in my situation. And yeah, it's been transformative for me. It's really allowed me to progress.
So you came back from that trip all fired up. You're all fired up, ready to go. So one of the crazy things you did was plant sunflowers right in with your sugarcane at the same time, what we call intercropping. What happened there, and how many neighbours didn't talk to you?
I did get ostracised to some extent, and probably still am to some extent, but the awareness is really growing now. By the time I'd completed my Nuffield scholarship, I was convinced that plant diversity was essential. I'd seen it performed in a number of different agricultural industries in a dozen different countries that I'd visited by a whole range of different farmers, so that they couldn't all be wrong, surely. So then how do I incorporate what is obviously a very good idea into a very conventional monoculture cropping system such as sugarcane? So initially you think the first thing you do is let's do a multi-species cover crop in the fallow. Instead of just doing a monoculture cover crop, which is what I was used to doing, just doing soybeans, why don't I do a multi-species cover crop? But I quickly came to the conclusion that was never going to be enough. Like it's only in sugarcane, because it's a perennial C4 grass, we plant it this year, harvest it next year, and then harvest the same root for a number of years after that. So realistically, what else could I do? Because 1 year in every 6 was never going to be enough. So then that led me to this idea of intercropping, which is not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. It's still been performed has been performed for a long time in India, as a classic example. They have a fairly big sugarcane industry, and certain parts of the Indian industry have always performed intercropping. But it's because they're subsistence farmers and they have to eat in between their cash crop, which is the sugarcane. So then they plant a whole range of vegetable crops primarily within their sugarcane, so they've got something to eat.
So you took that inspiration and tried to adapt it to your place, and
Exactly.
that first tactic you tried was sunflowers, and in agroecology we've got this term land equivalent ratio, or LER, which is, if I'm doing something different than my monoculture, I want to make sure I get either an equivalent yield or value out of the crop with a dual or multi-species compared to the monoculture. I can harvest the two different crops, and hopefully it's going to give me more than what the monoculture gave me. But the other thing, of course, is you're getting the soil building. So what happened? What was the end result of that first year's trial, or that first tactic?
Okay, so I originally chose sunflowers initially for a couple of very good reasons. So I was confident that I could harvest my sunflowers over the top of Mackay. So if you plant the two together roughly within the same week or so, the sunflowers being an annual are much quicker. So they'll get to maturity and I could harvest them over the top of the plant cane without doing too much damage. And I was also well aware that most of the industry is not in the same headspace as me. So how do I encourage adoption of this rather radical idea? And I thought immediately, if I could demonstrate an economic advantage and talk to their hip pocket, adoption would happen much quicker. So yes, I was successful in growing and harvesting sunflowers over the top of a proper plant cane in that first year, and I've done it again since then. I don't necessarily always set out to harvest the sunflower. Every season's different. And realistically, where I am at Mackay, and it'll apply to most of the east coast of Queensland, sunflowers are hard to get to maturity in a coastal environment. And while the seed in the head dries out nicely, the back of the head that hangs onto the seed doesn't dry out because of our rather humid, wet environment, and it makes difficulty for harvesting. In that first year, I deliberately planted Mackay relatively early, targeting October as a harvest date for the sunflowers, and it worked brilliantly. So October that year was exceptionally dry, which is a kind of climate that I need to be able to successfully harvest those sunflowers with no desiccation. Remembering I've got a young cane crop underneath, so I can't desiccate with chemicals.
So it really sort of leads us to the point that each paddock and each season, you've got to apply tactics differently following those key principles.
I don't have a recipe.
You've got to be flexible. And you've got the different options of a multi-species cover crop or an intercrop or an intercrop cash crop. You've got different options there, but that key principle of getting diversity out in the paddocks as much as possible through the crop cycle is a key learning that you got out of the Nuffield.
Certainly, that combined with the whole idea of maximising sunlight. So sugarcane, you harvest it and then it's got a period, and or plant, it's got a period then of around about 4 months when its sunlight use efficiency or its ability to capture sunlight is somewhat limited because it's a relatively small plant at that stage. So how could I capture more sunlight? Keeping in mind that probably my principal underlying soil health issue was low carbon levels. At 1% or less organic carbon in the soils, I had a real issue, and I knew that impacted on biological function, and then I needed to get it up. And realistically, the best way to do that is by growing plants themselves, because they have that photosynthetic ability to actually sequester carbon in soils, but you need growing plants to do it. So I have this window when the sugarcane's not cutting it, not doing the job. So how do I increase that? I add annual plants, which gives me diversity straight up because the sugarcane is a perennial. So I add annuals, and I add annuals primarily because they're so much quicker. So they've got that photosynthetic potential over that 3 to 4 month period to be able to maximise that. Once the sugarcane's canopied over, well, it's got the maximum sunlight capture potential. So I can't really do much beyond that. But yeah, that's my window.
So you're really boosting the photosynthesis potential of the paddock over time, bringing in that diversity. You've started to introduce a few other tactics to your farming system now over the last couple of years. Obviously, some biologicals and different fertilisers, but there's another thing you're throwing in there that I've heard about recently, and that's cattle. Can you explain how you brought cattle back into your cropping system?
Righto. I always knew when I'd finished the Nuffield that there was like a final step. And initially, once I completed the Nuffield, the whole plant diversity thing, I really got that, and I could implement that relatively easily. Particularly the first step being in the fallow. That was an easy step. And then to intercrop wasn't that much difficult either. Like, I'm still playing with timings and species and all of that stuff, but I know that I'm trying to capture sunlight. So that wasn't a big step for me either. But the introduction of cattle was a big step because all of a sudden I now needed a whole set of infrastructure that I never had before. However, I wasn't a newbie to cattle. I come off a cattle station, so I knew I had some cattle handling skills and I wasn't scared of that. But I did have to build some infrastructure, like yards and stuff like that, and do a lot of fencing. So I'd seen this idea of high-intensity rotational grazing performed in other parts of the world by farmers. How I took those ideas and tried to adapt them to my situation in sugarcane. And the idea is that in that first round or two of the harvest season, I'll as soon as that ground's harvested, I'll replant a multi-species cover crop on that ground, and then I'll split it up with electric fence. The boundary fence around that area is a 3-wire fence. Top and bottom are live, and the middle wire is an earth wire. Then all internal fencing is single wires. And the real key to electric fencing is just to keep good charge in it. If it's got good charge, the cattle get used to it very quickly, and then they have respect for it, and they rarely test it out after that. That's how come I can have a single wire on all 4 sides of my cattle now, and they almost never give it any grief. They've just got respect for it.
So do you see that bringing cattle into the cropping system with cane is another trigger to improve that soil health that's underpinning the farm business, but it's also actually shifting your farm from a cane farm to a mixed farm. So you're no longer a cane farmer, you're actually now a mixed farmer. Would that be a fair comment?
Certainly, and I like to call myself a mixed farmer today rather than just a cane farmer.
Yep.
Certainly, I need that plant diversity, but I also need that income diversity. The sugar industry, particularly at Mackay, has had a few issues over the last decade, and just being reliant on the sugarcane plant for production, well, for my whole business reliance has been challenging. So adding another enterprise in there has been well worthwhile. So the cattle are rotated across that area in a very intensive fashion. They're given a small plot every day or so and moved consistently. And they always have water with them. So I move the water with them. That way cattle aren't tracking back to a central water point and don't create cattle pads.
So you're able to bring cattle into what was really laid out as a cane paddock,
Yes.
and been able to bring in that infrastructure. So really, you're at a point where you've had a pretty significant, almost an identity change.
Yes.
You're no longer a cane farmer, you're a mixed farmer. You're still on the journey of soil health and building a farming system that's robust, and it's a challenge for the cane industry to start to think, I won't say radically, but in a major new way. So but it has to do it, I guess, as an industry, and I guess that's why we're at this forum, and that there's a lot of interest, and we've got 100+ farmers here because they are willing to sort of look at these new ideas and adapt.
Yeah, well, for me, it started out as improving my soil health to improve my productivity for McCain, but it's morphed into not only that, but also putting that resilience in my own business. So I'm not reliant on just the one single income that, has some real hiccups at Mackay. We've had serious issues. So now I've been able to add the beef cattle side to it. Plus I also do harvest some of these other opportunity crops like the sunflowers on occasions. I still harvest some soybean on occasion and chickpeas and various other bits and pieces. Largely, I don't sell a lot of that, but I quite often use it to supplement the cattle. So, I get some benefit out of it regardless of whether or not I can on-sell it.
Yeah, you can value add it on farm through another enterprise.
Yeah, I've got some questions. So if you're having the sunflowers with your cane, a lot of people might consider that you're mining more from your soil. What did you notice with your, following soil test or anything that you visually saw?
Okay. I get back to those underlying soil health issues that I had of lack of carbon, lack of calcium and compaction. So I choose plant species that can address one or all of those key background issues. And there isn't a plant species that can't help with carbon sequestration. So basically almost anything is on the table. And then I refine it depending on what the predicted season is, whether or not the cattle are going to graze in that area, because obviously you don't want to plant a species that could potentially be toxic to the cattle, and at what stage is that field. Like if it's a field that's already had significant plant diversity in it recently, I will try and change that plant diversity. As someone who's monocropped sugarcane for a long period of time, I'm very well aware that following one monoculture with another is not ideal. So I'd never plant back-to-back soybeans, for instance. But if soybeans have already been in the cover crop that was in there already, I wouldn't necessarily even have them as a monoculture following. So I really need to keep that diversity happening as much as humanly possible. It really is about biology. Regenerative farming stands on those 5 key principles of always having organic cover on the soil, minimising tillage, always have a living root in the soil, plant diversity, and integrating animals. So every time I'm looking at whatever the next thing is that I'm going to do to a particular block, I will have those 5 key principles in the back of my mind and trying to address my 3 underlying issues. So I don't consider any plant species on the planet as potentially off the table. I'll look at just about anything, but some will come with more benefits than others. A plant species that I'd love to have a go at the moment would be hemp. I think it comes with a whole suite of agronomic benefits that would be really good for the sugar industry, and that it has good possibilities as an intercrop that could possibly be harvested, the grain, over the top of plant cane, same as I do with my sunflowers. It's still got some issues with licensing and laws, and it's tough to get a license to grow it. So at this point in time, I haven't actually tried it, but it's certainly high on my list.
Have you been able to reduce your inputs with all of these other things that you've been doing? Yeah, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Well, the sugar industry itself has done a lot of this work, particularly around nitrogen, on how low can we go. Even in a monoculture crop situation, there's plenty of work within the sugar industry that suggests that even though the best management practices allows up to a certain amount, in my case it will allow up to 130 units of N applied.
So that's kilograms of nitrogen per hectare.
Yeah. The sugar industry's already done work to suggest that significantly lower levels than that could be feasible. So I have found that I can still grow as good a crop of cane as I did on 130 units down at 90. And I think I can get it down lower than that once I increase organic carbon levels, probably above 2%, which is where the rubber really starts to hit the road with biological function. I'm not there yet. So at the moment, I'm happy with 90. Phosphorus, I've actually come down from what was standard practice at around about 22 down to 10 to 12, so basically half. But I've actually increased my use of potassium and sulfur. So industry standards for sulfur suggests somewhere between 10 and 15 units of sulfur in my district, whereas I've found better results at 25. So the sugarcane plant is actually a luxury feeder on potassium and sulfur. I think the industry hasn't been allowing it access to enough of these elements and too much of the others. However, certain plant species make certain elements more available. And actually sunflowers, there's some evidence that sunflowers are relatively good at cycling potassium. So I'm hoping over time that I'll be able to reduce my level of need for potassium as well through multispecies.
And you've got a couple of scientists that are keeping an eye on your soil over the last few years, and they're monitoring soil biology and nematodes and a few things like that, mycorrhizal fungi. So you're really observing and keeping an eye on that change that you're aiming for, and seeing whether you're going in the right direction as best you can.
As best we can. We could always do with some more funding. Yeah, it's an expensive process, a lot of these things, especially once you get down into things like DNA, which we've been able to successfully do. Like we've used DNA sampling for things like establishing mycorrhizal fungi levels following my sunflower introduction. So we know that just by introducing sunflowers within a sugarcane field, we've taken the levels of mycorrhizal fungi from 2 species where it's just cane alone to 6 species where the cane and sunflowers are growing together at much higher levels. So that should translate into more available zinc and phosphorus, for instance. However, we didn't have the funding at that stage to take it any further than that. So there's always plenty more work to do. But I know that just by introducing seeds, I can radically change my biological makeup. Something else I'd like to add at this point in time is the whole idea of sunlight use efficiency. The agriculture in general talks a lot about water use efficiency, and water use efficiency is critical without doubt, especially in a country like Australia that's the driest continent on earth. But we've also got more sunlight than most countries, and we don't talk much, anything at all, about sunlight use efficiency.
It's really converting that solar energy into plant biomass as much as we can across the year. Yep.
Keeping in mind that I get back to that underlying issue for me and most of the sugar industry and most of Australia, realistically, low organic carbon levels. How can you increase that? Realistically, the only dead set way of achieving it is through photosynthesis, allowing the plants to do what they do best, which means you need to have plant diversity as much as possible, which gets back to one of those or two of those key principles of regenerative agriculture, always having that living root in the soil and plant diversity. That plant diversity enables a whole suite of different leaf architectures, and that different in leaf architecture is what allows you to maximize sunlight capture, because it doesn't matter what time of the day it is, you will have a leaf that's at the right angle if you've got plant diversity to capture maximum sunlight potential.
It's pretty much like putting solar panels on every side of your house, so you're
Exactly
always going
like
to be
that.
catching sun.
Yep.
Simon, I'm interested in, you actually have a short space of time that you can have your multi-species up and going, and then you want to be planting again or having your cane coming up. How do you manage your cattle? Are you trading them in? Are they messing up the controlled traffic areas? What are you finding?
So the cattle are there on around about, or a bit better than a quarter of the farm every year. So that's harvested early, planted to a multi-species cover crop, which is there for a year. And then it's planted late in the following season. So those cattle rotate across that area somewhere between 5 and 7 times over that 12-month period. I have to re-establish the beds after they've been, because invariably during that 12-month period there will be a wet period when they're in that multi-species cover crop. Even though I do have a couple of paddocks where I take the cattle to when I know I'm going to get heavy wet weather, invariably you'll get caught with what was predicted to be 5 mils and ends up being 50, especially here in the tropics.
Yeah, it's the opposite of down in the dry rivers of Australia, where you predicted for 50 and you end up getting 5.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So all of a sudden you've got 50 mils, and it happens at 6 o'clock in the evening. So I'm not going to try and shift them in the dark. That's just lunacy. So they're tramping around out there for all night, and you just had 50 mils or more. So yes, you will have potential for compaction regardless of how diligent you are. However, I think of it this way. Once again, compaction is one of those underlying issues. So in any combination of plant species that I grow, there will always be plants that are deep tap-rooted, so that can address compaction. Compaction is an issue for agriculture regardless of the industry, and certainly for the sugar industry it's a huge issue. To this point in time, we've tried to address it realistically only in one fashion, and that's been with the addition of controlled traffic. So trying to get everything on guidance, driving up and down the traffic lanes and never driving in the interspace. And at this point in time, that's all the sugar industry's done. And realistically, in a conventional sense, that's all they can do. They need to step outside the box. And in regenerative agricultural spaces, then you open up that idea of introducing plant species. And there's many plant species that have the ability to address compaction. So they're in there with the cattle, helping to address that.
And helping re-aggregate that soil.
Yeah. But another thing that the cattle are actually doing that you'll never get if you don't have them is dung beetle. So we all know how good worms are at creating channels in soil that allow air and water infiltration. Well, the dung beetle's even better at it than the worm is. But you won't have dung beetle unless you've got live cattle in your field, because dung beetle only live in fresh dung. So by introducing cattle, I get a key set of biology that most people never get access to. And for me, that addresses my compaction with the plant diversity and the dung beetle better than I could any other way. So although the cattle can cause compaction, I think I can alleviate it more than I create.
So obviously, Simon, you've been on a regenerative farming journey for a little while now, and you're confident in making decisions and sort of steering your ship, though you haven't solved all the problems, I'm guessing. But you just recently came back from Africa, where you're involved in the United Nations Environmental Forum. What was sort of some of the reflection you had on farming around the world? You know, what's probably the one or two big things that farmers can do to really make a change to the global environment as well as to their local farm? Yeah,
United Nations Environmental Assembly was a mind-boggling experience. They're trying to to set environmental and agricultural policy across the globe. They're trying to influence nations across the globe. I guess the idea of regenerative agriculture has really caught on, not only in the first world, but also in the third world. So it's a growing wave. And I actually see regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture as on an upward trend worldwide, hectares. And your conventional industrial model is actually on a downward trend worldwide. So, if you look at the trend, now's the time to get on the boat, if you will. Otherwise, it's going to leave without you.
As long as we don't hit the iceberg.
Yeah, there could be those icebergs. But I guess for me, after attending that, something that agriculture across the globe could do tomorrow that would make the biggest single contribution would be to change the intent of bare fallowing. So if we as farmers always intended to have a fallow that was covered, so always have a living root in the soil, as opposed to the standard practice now, which is the intent of having a bare fallow. Bare fallow is extremely bad for biological function.
So and really making that a social norm, almost like we all expected to wear seat belts, but if you make it sort of normal to want to have a growing fallow rather than a bare fallow, you're switching it on the head.
Exactly, and that would make a huge difference, because there's literally tens of millions of hectares that's bare every day of the year on the planet, and it doesn't need to be.
No sunlight
capture.
Yep.
It's actually going backwards, because biology and plants go together. If there's no plants there, the biology is actually dying.
And you're getting more radiant heat off the earth, which is actually, in fact,
heating the whole earth up.
So
if we've got green cover, it's actually cooling it down.
Contributing to climate change and climate warming,
And there's multiple benefits above and beyond that. But that's the simplest thing that we as farmers across the globe could do tomorrow that would have the greatest single impact.
Let's get on with it.
Yeah. Look, I think there's going to be some people listening to this in drought, and there's going to be some people who are in some very low rainfall areas. And I think if you listen to our podcast that I did with David, the last podcast we did, we really addressed that. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that podcast, because it takes time. And there are challenges to it down south, as what there might be to up in Queensland, but highly achievable. I think we just got to keep, shooting for that arrow.
Yeah. There's always going to be challenges, without doubt. Doesn't matter what you talk about. But the idea of shifting the intent is what I'm getting at. Like, if it doesn't rain, you can't grow anything. Fair enough. But if the intent is to have a covered fallow, in most cases, fellows will find a way to do that, as opposed to the intent of actually having it bare and deliberately spraying multiple times with Roundup or whatever, or cultivation, deliberately trying to keep it bare, thinking that they're doing the right thing.
So it's really a mindset change,
it is.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It is. If the intent is there to have it covered, much more of the world will be covered. And even if those plants only get 2 inches big, that's so much better than having a bare fallow. It has more potential, even at that smaller size, for carbon sequestration, for moisture capture and retention, you name it. Soil protection from high rainfall intensity, rainfall events. So it's something that's relatively simple that we could do tomorrow that would have a huge impact.
All right, I think we'll just wrap that up. That's fantastic. Great way to finish it up, Simon. So thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Nicola, and
awesome conversation.
Yeah. There's lots of amazing cane farmers up here in the wet tropics trying to change the systems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be talking to more soon, so you'll hear them.
Please follow the Biological Farming Roundtable podcast. Share it with your friends and networks. I'm Nicola Mattock, and I work at Nutrisoil, a liquid biological fertiliser made from a big worm farm whose purpose is to empower farmers to produce life-enriching food.